Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Pink and Channels. We're back because Norwich City have made a new signing, and they've made a new signing from South America, which is a region that we thought they'd probably head back into after the success of Gabriel Sara and Marcelino Nunez, and indeed they have. This one's very interesting, and I'm delighted to say to bring us his insight is Juan Arango. He's an expert on all things South American football, so it's really good to have you on our channels, Juan. Pedro Lima, he's the player that we're going to be talking about today. Signed on
Yes.
a season-long loan from Palmeiras in
Yes.
Brazil.
Mhm.
Let's start with what's he like as a player. What can Norwich City fans expect from him?
I guess everyone in Europe is aware of what Endrick in the hype that Endrick had, right? Of course, Kevin also. I mean, Palmeiras at this moment might have had probably the best group of young players coming out in Brazilian football. I already mentioned Endrick. I already mentioned Kevin. You can even go further back with Danilo, with Gabriel Menino. And there's been a lot of youngsters that have come out of Palmeiras pipeline, if you will. This will be a bit of a back and forth. So it's not just me, it's not you just asking me questions. I'll probably be asking you questions as well to give you the best answer possible. Um, he is without a doubt the engine in that Palmeiras under 20 side that of course has gotten so deep in the Brasileirão. And many are expecting high things. Now, many in Brazil, especially Palmeiras fans, Palmeiras blogs, people that cover Palmeiras, aren't too happy with him going to Norwich City. They actually believe he should get a fair chance to get some playing time with the first team at Palmeiras. The problem is that the other day, I want to say 3-4 days ago, maybe a little bit more, Abel Ferreira and his technical staff informed Pedro Lima he's not going to be in their plans. So that ends up being kind of a stumbling block for him to be able to get more minutes. So the point is that at the same time, Abel Ferreira does have him in his long-term plans in terms of what he wants to do with him at Palmeiras. So he wants him to get more minutes. He wants him to get more experience. Now, it ends up kind of being an answer, which leads to a question is, okay, he's one of the stars on the under 20 side at Palmeiras, one of the more fluid players, up and coming players for Palmeiras. He goes to Norwich City. Is he going to get more time at the under 20s at Norwich City, which at that point there'll be more criticism of Palmeiras, or will he actually have a crack at being one of the starters under David Wagner? That's going to be the big question mark that we have to see how he ends up developing within that Norwich City side.
Yeah, and that is the big question. I think Norwich
Mm-hmm.
fans are asking that question as well, because the way he's been announced and been paraded by Norwich City so far, it has been very
Yeah.
much under the umbrella of being a development signing so far. So going
Mm-hmm.
into that under 21 side with maybe a view of then heading into the first team at a later date, which I guess Norwich fans are looking at this and saying, well, why have you signed a player on loan for the under 21s? That's not a usual bit of
Mm-hmm.
business we see in England, really.
Exactly.
And also, why have Palmeiras loaned him out essentially from an under 20 side into an under 21 side?
Exactly. I mean, and that's what in Brazil they're saying. So I mean, it's not being disrespectful to Norwich City. No, no, no. It's not. It's Palmeiras is one of the best teams in this part of the world, if not one of the top two teams in this part of the world. Why are you sending them? Why are you sending him to a team in the championship? Albeit people in Brazil know that the championship is a very competitive tournament. But he's not going. But for all intents and purposes, he might not even be used in the championship. He's going to be used with the under 21s. So if that's the case, why don't you just leave him at Palmeiras, give him some playing time at Palmeiras, and not put him in a situation where he's going to get the same amount of playing time, but at the same level. It's kind of that glass ceiling that the only difference is you just change houses and go into another glass ceiling. I mean, that it kind of doesn't make sense from that perspective, and I kind of get the feeling that in England the same sensation applies, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of people are looking at it as well. And from Norwich's perspective, and if you speak to anyone who knows about these kind of things, it was a bit like they wanted to insert an option
Mm-hmm.
in the deal, obviously, that would have enabled them to make this potentially permanent if he did well next summer. I don't think
Mm-hmm.
Palmeiras wanted that. And so I guess they had to take a judgment on, do we have this player for a year in the hope that maybe there's a prospect next summer of convincing him to sign and convincing Palmeiras to let him go permanently? Or do we give up on the player and don't bring him? So it is a really complex one. And then I guess in the middle of these two clubs, and the argument there is kind of the player. So what do you think Pedro himself has thought about this move, and why do you think he has taken this step? Is it that carrot, I guess, of saying I'm probably more likely to get first team football at Norwich at this moment in time than I am at Palmeiras? What do you make of his reasoning?
Yeah, you hit it right on the nail. The possibility. Now, I don't know what David Wagner. I mean, David Wagner's been very adamant about, okay, the transfer market's closed. We're done. We're not looking for anyone else unless, and this is the unless, I guess you could say, maybe not. But when you see who has a better shot at getting there, right now we're almost in September. Palmeiras played today. By the way, Pedro Lima did not fly with Palmeiras to Colombia to play in the first leg of the quarterfinals of the Copa Libertadores. He is not in the plans of Abel Ferreira, like I said before, with Palmeiras in terms of the Brasileirão for the rest of the season. Right now, like I said, we're almost in September. The Brasileirão ends somewhere in mid-December. And then not only that, he won't be part of the team when the team resumes that 3-week off season that is Brazilian football. Of course, you end up having Christmas, New Year's, and then the week after New Year's, you come right back and a new season begins in Brazil in January. That'll be the beginning of the estaduais, the state tournaments in Brazil. He will not be available for that. He will be coming back off his loan in, I guess, May, thereabouts.
Yep.
So May will be just in time for the beginning of the Brasileirão in the month of May, going until December, if all those things apply. He also does end up missing the group stage, or part of the group stage of the Copa Libertadores next year. So it's kind of awkward. It's kind of an awkward situation for a player that, like I said, behind Endrick, has been rated amongst one of the biggest South American prospects. Obviously, he doesn't play the same position as Endrick. He's a little bit further back. He's very intelligent. He's very fluid in his play. A lot of people that have covered Palmeiras have told me, and this is them, and obviously you appreciate it when you see it, very mature in his decision-making processes when he has the ball at his feet, and very mature as far as where he needs to be in terms of spaces and his relation to the spaces and the ball and where he needs to be and make that next move almost immediately. Can play the ball 1-2 touches, can play very vertical, can play side to side, can be able to decongest and decompress and simplify situations. So when you have a player with that toolbox, it ends up being so complicated to go and say, what's going on? Why doesn't he get a chance? Why does he have to go to an under 21 elsewhere to be able to get playing time and maybe, just maybe, get a few games with Norwich City's first team?
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? It's a really strange one to get your head around. I mean, you kind of described him a little bit as a player there. Is it fair to say he's kind of a holding midfielder? Is that where you feel maybe his best position is in front of the back four, a bit more advanced? Where do you kind of see him in that midfield setup?
The classic, now I guess you can say, the classic box to box type of player. He can start at the back. He can join the attack. He can go from one end to the other. He gives continuity and fluidity to the run of play. Like I said, very good in his decision-making processes, is offensive, can be defensive. So he can play in many positions. It just depends on how it's going to be, how he's going to be implemented within a system that ends up being the key.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier when we were talking about the structure of this deal, how maybe it's not gone down particularly well with Palmeiras fans. Am I right in saying that he nearly moved to Portugal earlier in the summer on a loan, which I think the deal did include an option, and that was the fan backlash was so intense that both parties decided to sort of pull the plug on that deal. Tell us a little bit about that situation.
Well, now if you put that into perspective, then you say, well, might as well go to Norwich as under 21, to be quite honest, because he would end up going to a team. I forgot the name of the team. It's a second division in Portugal.
Yeah.
Well, for that, just go to Norwich City. Just go to Norwich City and play in the under 21s. I mean, again, putting this in perspective to that previous deal, and like you said, there was a lot of backlash in taking one of your highest and most precious youngsters and sending them there. Okay, he gets playing time, but what kind of playing time does he get? That's very important. It's not a knock on the Portuguese second division, but if you have a team in Norwich City that perennially, historically contends in the championship to either go up, they do go up on several occasions, but at the same time, they do end up being very, very challenging in terms of their system of play. That ends up being something that needs to be looked at, and that's an option that's quite important.
Yeah, no
Honestly.
worries. I'll fill in the meantime. But yeah, it's really interesting how this deal has panned out. Norwich, obviously exploring Brazilian markets, South America markets. We've
Mhm.
seen that with the two players that they signed, Gabriel Sara, Marcelino Nunez. Kind of feels like this deal, from their perspective, is to be visible in the Brazilian market as much as it is to sign the player. Do you think that's
Mhm.
fair as well?
Well, it is. I mean, it's the continuation
Yeah.
of that pipeline, if you will. I mean, even go back, Emiliano Buendia ends
Mm.
up also being one of those players that you say, well, if there's players like this in South America, let's start looking over there, plain and simple. And Norwich City has been one of those teams that has decided to have scouts constantly looking and searching for potential talent in South America. And so far, and I remember, well, a little bit, yeah, I guess you could say this time last year, I was talking to many people in Norwich about Gabi Sara, excuse me, and Marcelino Nunez and what they're capable of doing. And it took a little bit of time for them to get
Mm.
into the mix, but once they did, they became regular contributors to the squad.
And is that a factor with Lima, do you think? Because as we said, it kind of feels like it's a process. It feels like from Norwich's side, it's geared towards eventually pushing him into the first team. Is that taking into account the adaptation period that's usually required with players from South America? We've seen it, as you say, Gabi Sara had
Mhm.
probably a smaller one than Marcelino Nunez, who still feels he's kind of in that process of trying to adapt in to life in England, doesn't speak English yet. I think Lima speaks very good
Mhm.
English by all accounts. But is this do you see this being a slow process for him to work his way into the team?
Maybe it'll be slow, but a little less slower now that he does have two players that can kind of
Mm.
guide him along. And you hear Pedro Lima talk to media a lot, and he's very mature. He has a certain maturity when he speaks. He has a certain cadence and body language that gives you that kind of command, that kind of presence. And mind you, he's only 20. So it's not like I'm talking about a player that's 26,
Mm.
27. He's 20. And yet he was looked at as that leader, as that engine, as I said before, for that Palmeiras under 20. And yet many started looking, hey, why isn't he playing with the first team now? But then again, you look at the list of players that Palmeiras have in the midfield, and you kind of understand, okay, I bring this player in, who do I get out? And you really can't at this point. There might be some players departing next year from Palmeiras. So, Rafael Vega has been one mentioned over the previous few two, maybe three transfer markets that they've talked about him leaving Palmeiras, and he hasn't. So maybe you start looking at him as that possible replacement in the middle. Maybe if Danilo ends up being sold, of course, another youngster. Pedro Lima's 20 and Danilo's 23. So you have an idea of, okay, well, what do you do with those types of players? And Danilo will most likely be part of Brazil's Olympic side when they start qualifying in just a couple of months' time. Um, it's difficult. It's difficult for him, but he's accepted it. He's been able to take on the challenge. He knows what he has to do, and he knows the situation that he's going into. And he also knows what he needs to do in order to be able to flourish in this situation. Now, mind you, if he does flourish with his talents, maybe Norwich say, maybe I don't want him to go back to Brazil, like you said
Mm.
earlier. Maybe there's a chance to negotiate a chance to negotiate a contract where he ends up staying, where he ends up being able to stay at Norwich City. And you don't know. I mean, Norwich is, like I said before, a team that will contend to once again go back to the Premier League. Let's say, what if they do go back to the Premier League? You're going to need reinforcements, and you might need a player like that. And you know what? Maybe the possibility of selling him ends up being much more fruitful for a team like Norwich City and for Palmeiras in the meantime. I don't know. I'm just speculating right now, but it would be
Completely.
great to see if that ends up being the case. What does Norwich City do? He ends up going into the first team, ends up contributing, ends up being consistent, ends up being looked at by other teams in the Premier League or anywhere else. And, maybe this little short-term bump, this little short-term investment ends up being one that gives a lot of long-term benefits. I don't
Well,
know.
that was going to be my next question. I mean, you've mentioned it on the Norwich City side. What would
Mhm.
the Palmeiras side of that be? Because you've said how highly rated he is, how he's viewed as a spot in the future. Clearly, someone who's really high regarded by supporters. Would they be
Mhm.
open in the future? Do you think to speaking about a permanent deal? Yeah, I guess the numbers involved probably would make them
Yeah,
quite likely.
it would be a combination of that. It would be a combination of okay, does Norwich City end up? Does he end up playing first team with Norwich City? Does Norwich City end up going into the Premier League next year? Because then all of a sudden that changes a little bit. That ends up being a different seductive attribute to Norwich City compared to staying at Palmeiras. Okay, let's say he does stay a season in the Premier League. He does shine with Norwich City. Who knows what happens with the team? But he individually ends up getting interest from a Manchester United, from a Liverpool, the usuals, if you will, and they're willing to spend big money on him. All of a sudden, Palmeiras says, well, maybe we don't need him that much, but the money does come in well. So why not? We end up getting a cut. Norwich City ends up getting a cut. We're all happy. He's happy. He ends up having a career in the Premier League. It could work out. Again, you and I are just speculating. We're going out really, really far out there at this point, maybe a year or two in the future. But let's say it does work out for him. Where does it go? Where does he end up being?
Yeah, lots of questions around this deal. Just a couple of more general questions on Norwich and their foray into Brazil and South America more widely. You've mentioned the fact that they hire, I think, 2 professional scouts in the region. They're constantly looking for talent. How are they viewed in Brazil? Is there a view on Norwich City in Brazil? Are they seen, because of what Gabi Sarra has done in particular, as a viable step into Europe now? I think there's been such a desperation from the club to create that, and they've done a lot of work in the region to try and push themselves forward in the market. And I think done quite a bit of media in the region as well. What's their perception? What's the perception of Norwich City in Brazil at the moment?
Well, no, it's a team that for obviously not the Endricks or the Julian Alvarez or the Lucas Beltrans of the world that are highly, extremely highly touted. Then you have the next tier that are looked at by middle of the road Premier League teams and top level championship teams. It ends up being a viable avenue, not just to play top level, but to be able to make that jump into Europe. So they do see that. Brazilian fans see the Premier League. Brazilian fans maybe don't see the championship as much. Maybe a couple of years ago we did, or I include myself, because every week, it was like 3 seasons ago, I guess you could say now, when Leeds were playing in the championship under Marcelo Bielsa, every single Leeds match was being shown in South America every week for 2 seasons. Until obviously Leeds ended up going up to the Premier League. Then all of a sudden there was less attention being placed on the championship at that point. But it was one of the higher rated matches of the week in South America when it came to Leeds. Now, is it so much since Sarra and since Marcelino Nunez have come? No, not really. But there is an awareness of what these players do because they're always being tracked either for a possible transfer, for a possible call-up to the national team in the case of Marcelino Nunez, which he is part of the Chilean national team pool. So many pay attention to what he's doing. So yeah, there is a focus placed on it. Is it front and center? No, not necessarily, but they do pay attention to what Norwich City is doing week in, week out, especially towards the tail end of the year when it gets really interesting and when you start seeing, okay, which teams end up being promoted, which teams end up being relegated, that type of situation, then yeah, you do have a lot of Norwich City being looked at.
Yeah, and just finally, because I know, and you referenced it as well, you spoke about Gabi Sarra last summer when he made the move across from Brazil to Norwich. How do you make of what he's done so far? I mean, it feels like he's in that sort of conversation at the moment where people are maybe beginning, nothing sort of tangible, but certainly beginning to speak about him as possibly now looking and feeling more like a Premier League player. What have you made of his progress over the last year or so at Norwich City? Because I think everyone over here has been really impressed by what he's done.
Yeah. And I said that you would be impressed with what he's able to do. I might have been wrong in terms of the timetable, but in terms of his potential, I wasn't. And I mean, I'm not trying to toot my own horn here. It's just I'm actually trying to toot his horn because he was able to make that adaptation. I had nothing to do with it, so that's nothing to do with me. It has to do 100% with him and what he's been able to do. And to be honest with you, under the tutelage of a coach like David Wagner, you can end up seeing probably some very interesting things this season as well that will make that thought or that narrative of him being a Premier League player even stronger. Because I think 2 years under his belt, he's more accustomed to to the surroundings of Norwich, knowing what he's up against, because going into that first season, they tell you, yeah, the championship is difficult, the second division is difficult, but it's something you have to go and live and experience yourself. And I think coming in, he's a bit more mentally prepared. He understands the rigors of what is asked of him and what he has to do in order to be prepared. So I think this time around, the second season under his belt, he might be able to do a lot better, barring any type of unforeseen obstacles or injuries or things of that nature.
Juan, thank you very much for your time, your insight. I really appreciate that. Like you say, so many questions thrown up by this deal. We've tried to answer
oh, no doubt.
quite a few of them.
There's still a lot more that could be generated. So this might not be the last time we end up talking. But
yeah,
a lot of things can come out of this, and it's going to be an interesting time. It's going to be an interesting time for the player, for Norwich, and maybe you end up getting an unexpected contributor. Who knows? You might end up getting the leader in the midfield for you for the next few years.
Yeah, and wouldn't that be lovely? And I'm certain that because of Norwich City's growing links in South America, we will be speaking to you a lot more over the coming months and years into the future. So thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate you joining me.
Fingers crossed.
And we will speak again very, very soon. And thank you all very much for watching.
No, thank you very much.